The development of international human rights has been characterized by the progressive expansion of human rights to many groups that were historically denied of these protections. Many of these groups are minority groups that were oppressed and have been marginalized in societies with dominant groups. Minority status can be based on gender, race, religion, ethnicity, caste, political affiliation, or sexual orientation. Today, there are several international human rights laws, declarations, and covenants that are aimed at protecting the rights of disadvantaged minorities. Various regional and national human rights regimes have also made provisions for minority rights protection. So although we have documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Covenant, which protects the rights of everyone, there is recognition that there is need to protect the rights of certain vulnerable minority groups. These minority groups deserve special protections. In this class, we will examine some of these minority rights issues from global human rights perspective. The list of international human rights instruments enacted to protect the rights of minority groups has grown significantly since the 1960s. The key international human rights instruments for minority rights protection include the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities. This is also known as the Declaration on Minority Rights. These instruments outline the obligations of states and the international community to protect the rights of minority groups. The United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that in countries where ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right to live in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. Similarly, the Declaration on Minority Rights requires states to protect the national, ethnic, cultural, religious, and linguistic identity of minority groups within their territories and encourage conditions for the promotion of minority identities. Among the obligations of states outlined in a minority declaration is protecting a minority group's existence and survival, including protecting their physical integrity and preventing genocide against them. States are also obligated to protect the rights of national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups to affirm their collective identity and prevent forced assimilation. In addition, states are obligated to ensure equality and non-discrimination against minority groups and to facilitate their participation in public life. Apart from these general provisions for the protection of the rights of minority groups, there are also several international human rights laws aimed at protecting specific minority groups, such as the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Their Families, and the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights and Dignity of Persons with Disabilities. Similar minority rights provisions can also be found in regional human rights documents such as the European Covenant on Human Rights and the Constitutional Bill of Rights of many countries. For the purposes of this class, however, our focus will be on the rights of indigenous people and LGBTQ persons as examples of minority rights struggles and protection. The rights of indigenous people provide a good example of minority rights issues. It is estimated that there are about 370 million indigenous peoples worldwide in over 90 countries. Although they make up 5% of the global population, indigenous people account for about 15% of the extremely poor. Indigenous people exist in every continent. In Canada, indigenous people make up about 5% of the population, while in the United States they make up only about 2% of the population. Indigenous communities in many parts of the world have suffered historic and contemporary human rights violations, including systematic genocide, land dispossessions, cultural repressions, social marginalization, and political exclusion. According to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, the first century and a half of British Aboriginal relations in Australia can be characterized as a period of dispossession, physical ill treatment, social disruptions, population decline, economic exploitation, discrimination, and cultural devastation. One example of such historic violations is the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, a conflict between U.S. soldiers and the indigenous Lakota people that led to the death of over 300 indigenous men, women, and children. In Canada, the Oka Crisis of 1990, a violent land dispute between a group of Mohawk people and the town of Oka in Quebec, exemplifies the continued tensions in relationship between indigenous people and the government. It is in recognition of these long-standing human rights violations that indigenous people continue to face that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, specifically to protect indigenous people worldwide. While the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is not a legally binding instrument under international law, it reflects the commitment of United Nations member states to addressing historic and contemporary violations of the rights of indigenous people. It is an important standard for the treatment of indigenous people worldwide. The Declaration sets out the individual and collective rights of indigenous people, as well as their rights to culture, identity, language, employment, health, education, and other issues. It emphasizes the right of indigenous people to maintain and strengthen their own institutions, cultures, and traditions, and to pursue their development in keeping with their own needs and aspirations. Significantly, it prohibits discrimination against indigenous people, and it affirms the need to promote their full and effective participation in all matters that concern them, and their right to remain distinct and to pursue their own visions of economic and social development. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was referred to the United Nations General Assembly, which voted upon the adoption of a proposal in 2007. The vote at the United Nations was 143 countries in favor of the declaration, 4 countries against, and 11 countries abstaining from the vote. The only 4 countries that voted against the Indigenous Rights Declaration were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. Canada will later sign on to the declaration. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People addresses several issues relating to the rights of Indigenous people. These include issues of racism, respect for indigenous language, culture, and spiritual traditions, recognition of self-determination, protection of indigenous environment and citizenship rights, improvement of social and educational opportunities for indigenous people, and upholding historical treaties and agreements with indigenous people. In Canada, a key indigenous rights issue centers on historical cultural dispossession. Indigenous people have suffered criminal sanctions for traditional cultural and political practices. The Government of Canada, through the Indian Act of 1880, attempted to suppress indigenous cultural expression by placing a ban on indigenous dance ceremonies and festivals. Indigenous people were also denied the unconditional right to vote until 1960. Before then, indigenous enfranchisement required the abandonment of reservation rights and the right to live with one's family and culture. In Australia, the constitution enacted in 1901 stated that Aboriginal people should not be counted as part of the population of the country. Many countries are now trying to account for and remedy the human rights abuses inflicted on indigenous people. In Canada, this has taken the form of a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission established to account for the history and impact of the Canadian Indian residential school system on Indigenous students and their families. Another minority group that has suffered exclusion from human rights protection are LGBTQ people. Bringing sexual minorities under the full protection of international human rights law has become the latest frontier in the struggle for inclusivity within the human rights movement. Across the world, discriminatory laws and policies affect the rights and well-being of LGBTQ people. In some countries, LGBTQ persons are criminalized and imprisoned, and even the death penalty is prescribed as punishment for same-sex sexual activity or identity. Political homophobia encourages physical violence against LGBTQ persons. In many countries, LGBTQ persons are targets of organized abuse from religious extremists, paramilitary groups, extreme nationalists, as well as family and community violence. Although current human rights laws can broadly be interpreted in ways that address some of the forms of discrimination and oppression they experience, international human rights law has largely been silent on the rights of LGBTQ persons. Although more human rights organizations are now taking up sexual minority rights advocacy and campaigns, the rights of LGBTQ persons are still not considered mainstream human rights issues in many countries. Until recently, there were few international legal instruments and institutions that explicitly addressed human rights violations as they pertain to LGBTQ persons. As with other minority rights issues, the central issue with LGBTQ rights protection is the internationally recognized right to non-discrimination. The main obstacle to the inclusion of LGBTQ rights in mainstream human rights advocacy are typically religious, socio-cultural, and institutional. These exclusionary barriers continue to exist in varying degrees in every region of the world. The history of the universal human rights movement has been a history of progressive rights inclusion. The project for rights inclusion has involved working to ensure that there are support systems for the protection, the universal protection of fundamental freedoms and fundamental rights that are available to all members of the human community, not just to some privileged people. However, the project for human rights inclusion is continually challenged by exclusionary forces driven by politics, religion, culture, and institutional practices. International human rights standards have certainly helped to overcome some of the historical and contemporary forms of discrimination and exclusion of minority groups. However, despite the promise of international human rights principles, the reality today is that many minority groups remain excluded from the most basic human rights protections that are available to many people. The persistence of such exclusion poses a challenge to the normative universality of human rights and reflects the unfulfilled promise of the human rights revolution.